privilege to partner with ADATA in this report and this project, and of course to work with the Asia Society Policy Institute as well. And I'm especially grateful to our ISEAS here, our partners, and all of the really terrific staff that have made today possible. It's really been a fantastic partnership. You have the bios of all of our speakers, but I do want to just very briefly introduce them. To my left is Dr. Malcolm Cook, who is Senior Fellow at ISEAS, Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Yusof Ishak Institute here in Singapore. And then to his left is John Garnaut, who is currently with JG Global, previously was a principal advisor at the Australian Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and prior to that a senior advisor to Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, and formerly a correspondent with Fairfax Media. And then to his left we have Dr. Zhao Kejin, who is at Tsinghua University in Beijing, Deputy Director of the Center for U.S.-China Relations and a professor at the Institute for International Studies. And then finally, Peter Mattis, who's a research fellow in China Studies at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, and previously worked at the Jamestown Foundation, editing the China Brief. So with that, we're going to have basically a conversation about China's public diplomacy. And I want to start with you, Dr. Zhao, because you have written an enormous amount on Chinese public diplomacy. And I know you've been conducting a project over the last few years where you have interviewed a very large number of people, particularly in China, about China's public diplomacy. And you have found that there's different schools of thought, and you've argued in your writings China's public diplomacy is not simply aimed at enhancing China's soft power or promoting its international image, that the goals are actually really rather deeper than that. And you've argued that China's public diplomacy is intended to earn respect domestically in China and to gain political legitimacy from the international community. So I want to start by asking you if you could elaborate on that. What is China really trying to do from your perspective with its public diplomacy? And is it learning? So if we look at over the last, particularly since 2009, when Hu Jintao really emphasized public diplomacy, it's been now almost a decade. Do we see China learning? Are its goals evolving, or have they been revised? So why don't we start with that?
Thank you, Bonnie. Good morning, everyone. Fundamentally, public diplomacy is a word from the U.S. in China, and previously, particularly during Hu Jintao's administration, these words usually indicates China's endeavor to offset the China's threat in international community, particularly since 2003. And after Beijing Olympic Games in 2008, President Hu Jintao initiated these words publicly and officially. That's launched a hot wave of public diplomacy around the country. And fundamentally, there is a big change in understanding public diplomacy from Hu Jintao's era to Xi Jinping's era, because China has surpassed Japan as the #2 economy in the world, and China has faced up a different international environment. That's drives Xi Jinping to think about strategically China's foreign policy. So according to my observation, so the strategic consensus of China's foreign policy has been broken. So there are diversified wars in China. So how to unify them and how to bring them together to give a leadership legitimacy. That is a top priority for President Xi. So in China, President Xi, very few to mention about public diplomacy. He preferred to people-to-people diplomacy. Maybe in the coming months, he will launch another working meeting on people-to-people diplomacy rather than public diplomacy. And in government officials' understanding, public diplomacy is a very strict words. So just as a data analysis report, financial diplomacy is not a component of public diplomacy. It's the officials talk it is economic diplomacy. The economic diplomacy is another organ of foreign policy. And so for President Xi, how to unify the different voice in the government is the top priority for public diplomacy. So according to my studies, under Xi's leadership, we changed the policy of keep low profile to strive for achievements. So to be a great power, to be strong nations around the world. So for President Xi's agenda to unify the different voice, particularly the retired top leaders such like President Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao is the most important. Only does President Xi unify their voice in foreign policy or public policy, he can do something. So since 2012, China launched a big wave of international initiative for BRI and some other programs related to public diplomacy. All these endeavors have a same goals to consolidate the leaders' legitimacy domestically and internationally. For domestically, so with a different with the anti-corruption campaign, the foreign policy and the public diplomacy will convince the audience domestically to support our strong leaders. And internationally, if the foreign leaders and the general public give a high support towards China, that identified the new leaders is strong enough. So with the Central Committee approved President Xi as a leadership call in Central Committee, that's goals has been satisfied. So all in all, the main focus or main strategic orientation for the public diplomacy is to consolidate political legitimacy domestically and internationally. Thank you.
Let me now turn to you, John Garnaut. From the perspective of a target country, of course, every country in the world is a target country for another nation's public diplomacy. And so Australia, of course, is a target country for Chinese public diplomacy. What does China's public diplomacy strategy and objectives look like? And what is the story that China is trying to tell?
Sure, thank you, Audie. I think Dr. Zhao gave us a very useful starting point there, because he's talking about, one, that public legitimacy itself is not a very natural Chinese category, and so we're going to probably find greater utility if we expand that category to other forms or broad forms of political influence abroad. And I think the other thing that Dr. Zhao said that was very useful, and we can tease out a little bit, is the people-to-people links. What exactly does that mean? And in many ways, this is not a new thing for China. And the people-to-people links I think you were talking about are using structures and really theories that date back to the early revolutionary period. And in your writing, you've talked about, for example, organisations, various friendship organisations like the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries. Now, this was established in 1954. Xi Jinping gave his important speech to give it extra status, I think. And at the 60th anniversary in 2014. And when you sort of look at those sorts of organisations, and you look again at the Chinese Communist Party organisation chart, I think you can start to see that what the party does is influence. You know, this is a core mission of Chinese politics, and there are internal-facing organs and policies, by which I mean inside the party, and there are external-facing organs and methodologies, and by which I mean outside the party. And the interesting aspect of this for us as potential target countries is that mission doesn't necessarily stop at China's jurisdictional borders. And so a lot of these organisational efforts and unifying the voices, to use Dr. Zhao's terminology, extends deep into countries like Australia, Fiji, which we talked about, and other countries in Southeast Asia, the Pacific, and the United States. So I think in Australia and elsewhere, we're starting to catalyse a conversation which is really about teasing apart what does people-to-people links look like, organisationally, how are they structured. We're rediscovering core party organs we hadn't really thought enough about, like the International Liaison Department. You know, this is one of the handful of core party organs. There's never been an English language book about it. It's extraordinary, right? The United Front Work Department, this is a core party organ, very active in Australia and all around the world. There's never been a book written about it since 1957, and so we've had to go back and sort of start again at what the Communist Party is and how it works abroad. Now, from Australia's point of view, we now face this kind of, if we look again at what Beijing is doing externally, what aspects of its activities fit into public diplomacy, into a category that we're comfortable with, that is transparent, that does attach Beijing's branding to advocacy elements. And I think a lot of the conversation we're seeing is starting to also identify aspects of political influence that we're less comfortable with. And in a sentence, I think we're really starting to look again at activities that can be perceived to have a covert aspect, or a corrupting aspect, or a coercive aspect, in my terminology, the 3 Cs. And this is activities that we're starting to say identify as. We would much prefer China operates within the transparent public diplomacy lanes and less in ways that are coercive or corrupting or clandestine. And when you talk about unifying the voices, what is the voice? What is the story that China is trying to tell in answer to your question, Bonnie? Well, I think one core story it tells, it's really an assumption, is to try and, as part of the political legitimacy building exercise, is trying to conflate the categories of party, nation, and people. And you see this in various manifestations in all sorts of official and quasi-official publications, where trying to encourage people outside China to think about Beijing, the Communist Party, and China and Chinese people as the same thing. Now, this is this is a category which I think lots of people are very uncomfortable about, but I think that is one objective of telling China's story. And then there are 3 elements. The first element is telling a story that depicts China as being peaceful and benign, or perhaps even uniquely peaceful and benign. The second element is telling a story of inexorably rising power, that whatever is happening now, whatever tactical games are being played, you know the answer. In the end, China's going to be much more powerful than it is today, and everybody is going to be less powerful, so let's get the program early. And the third element to this, which is internally inconsistent, but you can sort of understand it because there's lots of different vehicles, vectors for messaging, and they don't all come from the same source at the same time to the same targets, is even though there's this meta story of China's peaceful, win-win, benign intent, there's also an element of, but if you get in the way of China's objectives, it can really, really hurt. And so you combine these elements, the conflation of party, nation, and people, win-win, peaceful rise, inexorable rise in power, and danger, the risk of getting in the way of China's objectives, and that adds up to a program which is designed to affect our language, our perceptions, and ultimately our choices, our behaviour, and how we approach China-related issues.
Let me turn to you, Peter. There's, I think, a useful distinction that's been made that I'd like to tease out a bit between influence and interference. So is what China is doing both influence and interference? And you've also written about how China and Russia differ in this regard. So maybe you could speak to some of the differences between what China and Russia are doing, the tools they use, and the extent to which they are seeking influence and interference.
One of the important distinctions to think about with influence and interference is that when you use a word like influence, it means quite literally everything from something with the subtlety of the gravitational pull of the moon and its effect on tides to a very vicious punch in the face. You know, that's a really wide spectrum of activity that just doesn't really warrant being put together in the same sentence to say, well, China's doing this. I think this is perhaps something that I think deals with in the report, that it's talking about public diplomacy, but if you look at it from the CCP side or even the PRC State Council side, it's actually lumping together a variety of activities that are very firmly distinct in their system. What I think is valuable about interference is, number one, as a rhetorical point, it's something that the CCP and the PRC say they do not do in foreign countries. And so it allows us to say, look, this is a set of activity that you consider unacceptable or we consider unacceptable, and we can talk about it in those terms. The second is that it distinguishes between what is sort of normal interaction between states and people and what are deliberate efforts to exploit that to undermine the political system of the other side. Because there's a certain, you can't exchange, you know, some of these, to pick an example out of the report talking about exchanges being two-way. Some of these exchanges are two-way. I remember the first time I met Professor Zhao, actually was a conference in 2012, and it was very much an exchange, very heavy back and forth of ideas. But when you're dealing with, say, the United Front Work Department, as opposed to something put together by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the United Front Work Department is an organization where its cadre are selected because they can appear to be ideologically loose, but are in fact have an iron discipline within, so that they're people that the party trusts to sort of operate out in the wild, if you will, and they'll make it seem like an exchange, but it's not actually a vector into the system. It's more of a one-way street. Yet both of these things are being listed as exchanges, and it's important, I think, to understand what side of the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party is doing these things. And so it's not just a distinction between the types of activities, but also a point that we should look at who in the Chinese system we're dealing with, and not simply lumping it all together. To touch quickly on the distinction between the Russian and the Chinese perspective, as both John and Mr. Zhao pointed out, there's something constructive about the Chinese messaging. We are trying to build something here. We're trying to build a strong country. We're trying to rise within the international system. And there's a positive connotation with it that I don't think is present on the Russian application of sort of active measures and disinformation in today's age. There's a bit of on the Russian side, a bit of we're going to burn this down, because there's not necessarily a positive message that Moscow can provide. And that's I think one of the key distinctions between the two. The second is that the Russians have also thought about this influence or interference as a kind of campaign. There's sort of a policy objective that's identified. There are modes of operations that are sort of farmed out to different departments, and there's a campaign to achieve those objectives and see what comes of it. On the Chinese side, I think when you look at something like United Front work, or people-to-people exchanges, or liaison work, or any of a host of the things that are being lumped under public diplomacy, you see a way of doing business, a day-to-day operation of government. The United Front Work Department, for example, is not only is it run by a Politburo member, but that Politburo member is on the Secretariat, and they have day-to-day control over policy that's already been decided. And I think it's telling that something like United Front Work is in this sort of category of policy that's already been decided and can more or less just keep functioning. And that's, you know, for both Russia and China, it's a way of doing business and a way of interacting with the world. But one has a much more structured purpose, and the other one is we're going to build relationships and we're going to maintain these interactions because the long-term payoff on this is direct.
Malcolm, from your perspective, what determines whether Chinese public diplomacy is successful in these target countries? What are the factors that really enhance the impact and efficacy of public diplomacy, and how should we, what would you see as the appropriate criteria from your perspective in assessing this, the efficacy?
Thanks, Bonnie. It's quite chilly up here, reminding me of growing up in Canada. So first of all, the aid data reported noted that 3 top countries for public diplomacy efforts were, if I remember, Japan, Australia, and South Korea. I've had the chance of living in all 3. And I've lived in the Philippines, which at the moment is a new target or host. And I think in Singapore, even though it's not covered in the report, there's lots of interest about Chinese public diplomacy and other efforts in Singapore. So I'm taking it from there. Let's see, so I think one measure, I think there's 2 benefits for Chinese public diplomacy that are somewhat counterintuitive, and they're to do with host countries. So if I look at Australia, for example, where I spent 13 years and became a citizen, there are a number of Confucius Institutes that are mentioned in the report, but if you look at the number of China studies centers, both in universities and in think tanks, and the number of people that are employed and paid to study China, not necessarily all telling a positive story, but talking about China, it's much, much larger. So, for example, in Australia, before the United States Study Center was set up, and now they have a Perth one, there was only 1 US study center in all Australian universities, 37 Australian universities, and it had a staff of 1.5 people, and had a student equivalent of 12. So they had 12 students. I used to be the dean of the college that had this sole American Studies Center. Whereas if you compare Chinese Studies Center and the amount of money that Australian universities have put into just Australian universities, it's the same in Singapore. RSIS, I think, has a small US studies program with a Canadian at the head of it, which is good. There is no Singapore think tank that focuses on the US role in the world. At ISEAS, there's nobody that focuses predominantly on the US role in the world, despite the US being the largest economy, by far the largest source of FDI at a national level in Singapore. But there was a Chinese person. There is a East Asia Institute here that covers Northeast Asia, but if you want to study South Korea, North Korea, and Japan, it's probably not a great place to go. If you want to study mainland China, it's a really good place to go. Taiwan, a little bit. So that all brings in one thing about public diplomacy is having people talk about you and try to present how Chinese or whatever China is views the world and how we should understand it more. So I think one really interesting measure would just be the number, for example, in all of these countries of China-focused centers or researchers versus any other country, and you'll find a huge one. And another interesting one, IR structure. In Canada, we have a game called King of the Hill. So in winter, you build a big snow mountain and you fight to get to the top of the hill, throwing snowballs at each other. And then when the king, it's always a king because it's gendered, gets to the top, everybody else throws snowballs at the king of the hill until they're pelted off the top. The United States for decades has been the king of the international or even regional hill here. And certainly one of the benefits for China telling its story is we can challenge the king of the hill that you've been throwing snowballs at for so long. Nobody else has. And that's a kind of really interesting dimension, I think particularly relevant in non-Western countries that have certain civilizational concerns with the nature of the interstate system and its white Atlantic origins. China presents a model that's part of their public diplomacy outreach that says you can change that, and many people in Singapore, including some very authoritative voices, certainly push that argument as well. Thanks.
I want to turn back to you, Zhao Kejin, to talk about this issue of whether China's public diplomacy is really public, and this came up, of course, in our earlier session. And the title of this report and its purpose is to try to quantify China's public diplomacy efforts. And we heard from Brad Parks earlier about how foreign aid in general in China has really not been very transparent. This data has really not been made publicly available, and so studying this is really challenging because we have to look for ways to get accurate data. So I wonder if you can explain from China's perspective, and of course your personal perspective, why China is not more transparent about its public diplomacy efforts, and about how resource allocation is determined. And maybe you can even provide us with a little bit of insights and visibility into how those decisions are made in China, where which countries will get which public diplomacy efforts, or which country will get more money, perhaps through a loan for the Belt and Road Initiative, and which country will get less, because it's so opaque.
This is a very good question. Just as Michael mentioned, there are very few American centers in Australia, and lots of Chinese centers around the world. So that's good news for US, bad news for China. Why? Because in the eyes of Australia and Singapore's citizens, America is not a trouble. So it's not necessary for them to study US. They are very familiar with the US. But for China, China is a trouble. So we hope in the coming 100 years, China can be a less interested in public diplomacy. So we let the people to do their own job and to have a choice, to develop the communication with the counterparts around the world. Now let's back on this question. So in China, diplomacy is a very, very sensitive word. There are only small communities, small skills of members can have an opportunity to involve in diplomacy. Not only to traditional diplomacy, but also to public diplomacy. So according to my observation, there are only one power center in the mechanism of public diplomacy. That is just the presidency or the President Hu Jintao. So all the endeavors from different government agencies should provide support to President Xi's foreign agendas. So there is a very effective coordination among the high-level leaders to help President Xi to have project a good image around the world. So just as the report mentioned, the allies to allies visit can have a positive influence in the hosted countries. But there is a question, there is trouble. All the government agencies, such as MOFA, Ministry of Commerce, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Culture, all want to provide some support to the top leaders. They can rival for the power. There is a strong power struggle among the government agencies. So that is also the trouble of the top leaders. So maybe we just need the top leaders to launch coordinate missions. No others can help him. Even Mr. Yang Jiechi and other top leaders, they cannot coordinate all the the government apparatus, foreign policy. A good example is the military's presence in over South China Sea. So I identified the spokesman in foreign affairs, Minister of Foreign Affairs, usually reject the questions from the journalists or respondents. It is true, they do not know the reality about the military activities. That's military activity usually led by the military organs. So that's the trouble for top leader. So from the eyes of President Xi, he want to bring them together to have a orderly arrangement for the public. But it is very difficult for him because he has a lot of important statecraft affairs to be dealt with. And so he want to bring them together, but he have a very limited resources and energies. So maybe some days ago, on a new working meeting on foreign affairs, President Xi launched the new reform in foreign affairs management. That can tell us he want to have a new institutional arrangement. Maybe Mr. Wang Qishan will play a very important role to do that. But we should wait and see to what extent he can change the situation. Thank you.
Let me just follow up quickly. We talked a little bit earlier about, there was a question about the Foreign Aid Commission, the new department that was set up. Do you think that will lead to greater transparency about what China is doing, particularly in the area of foreign aid?
So it is very difficult to give more transparency for these organs. So the solution is to organize a new track of public diplomacy. But President Xi resists competition to use the words because the words is used by the United States. So in China, we have similar words such like people-to-people interaction and external communication. But in the coming month, I mentioned earlier, there is another track of people-to-people diplomacy working conference. That will accompany the lots of non-government players and the local government players and even think tank universities and mass media to be to take some role in the public diplomacy. So that's China's understanding towards public diplomacy. We should keep in mind. Thank you.
So, John, a lot of what China is doing in its public diplomacy sounds very benign. We talked earlier about the Confucius Institutes, for example, and there are many universities, of course, around the world that welcome the opportunity to have Chinese language teachers, more opportunities for people to learn Chinese. But I think as the report, a data report demonstrates, not all of these public diplomacy activities are benign from the perspective, again, of the target countries. So can you talk a little bit about what the risks are that some of these public diplomacy activities really pose to other countries, and what needs to be done maybe to address them?
We've talked already a lot about transparency, and I think that really that is the key. So, and there is no question that there is a lot of benign public diplomacy coming from China, and Confucius Institutes may be examples of that, depending on how they're managed within their host institutions. So the question, I think, is if China is having trouble imposing transparency on its broad external dealings, then it becomes incumbent on the rest of us to impose transparency on them ourselves. So I think we're already seeing a lot of efforts to disentangle these different organisational structures that we're seeing in our host countries to start to shine sort of sunlight on them, particularly where state links aren't clear, and we need to be able to pin those links to foreign external influence activities, and where they become not benign. I think by definition, if a foreign state actor is operating in a way that's non-transparent, then that is a problem for our societies, particularly open democratic societies, because that's not the way that we function well. For our political systems to work to mediate different interests, then they have to be labelled properly. So the first category of non-benign activity is non-transparent activity, and as I said before, the two other categories we've got to watch very carefully, where inducements are used in a corrupting way, and there's lots of anecdotal examples of this, but there's not enough systematic studies to really collate what's happening here, and difficult because these activities are by definition non-transparent. So you need to do work to actually fish them out. But where activities are corrupting in any way, that is a problem for host countries, and particularly where activities are coercive, and there's often a pattern where inducements are used and then to create relationships of dependency, and at some point the China-linked entity can threaten to withdraw an inducement which has become instrumental in the host organisation's activities. And so inducements can quickly flip towards coercion, at certain trigger points, and that leaves host countries and host individuals and institutions acutely vulnerable. So, to use my favourite acronym, it's the 3 Cs, where activities are covert in some way, corrupting in some way, or coercive in some way. It doesn't work with open democratic systems, and inevitably it will be catalysing pushback.
So maybe I can add something about the transparency of China's public diplomacy. So just now I mentioned the people-to-people interaction. There is another pillar, high possible to make China's public more transparent than before. That is we call it a multilateral framework or regional cooperation framework for public diplomacy. For example, for AIIB, so China joined the AIIB and maybe promote some initiative and agenda through the framework of AIIB. All these endeavors are very high transparency in the bilateral transparency. First of all, most of the scholars focus on the bilateral dimension of and with a state-centric model of the public diplomacy. We should beyond the model. China has changed the the established model presented by U.S. and other members.
And that's a good example. The infrastructure bank, to the extent that it is operating transparently and in accordance with established multilateral rules, then we should be encouraging it.
And of course, China's preferred, I think, mode of interaction still remains bilateral. Well, of course, at the same time, China participates in so many multilateral organizations, but I think when it comes to public diplomacy efforts, most of those really remain in the sort of bilateral track. Others should feel free to jump in on the conversation. I wanted to ask Mattis, who lived in so many countries in the region, about the specific challenges that are faced by countries that have large Chinese diasporas. And we certainly see in many countries where Chinese language media is being influenced, bought out in many places by China. And in some places, there is no independent Chinese media at all. So how do you look at this issue?
Thanks. So 2008 Olympic torch relay, I was living in Canberra at that moment, the bush capital of Australia. And my wife, who is Filipina, probably has, I'm not quite sure, some ethnic Han blood in her lineage, but not much, and has never identified herself as an oversized Chinese person herself, and certainly has no affinity with the foreign policy or many of the domestic policies of the People's Republic of China. During the torch relay in Australia, which became quite controversial and woke up a lot Australia to some of these issues. I think she received, not from the Chinese embassy and not from any clear sign, a flood of social media entries from people she didn't know, talking about how the Western media was misrepresenting China. Fake CNN, I think this was before Donald Trump was talking about fake news, fake CNN, and a huge, probably on one day she received over 200 different social media postings on hers, and even emails, even though she didn't know that her email was a public, email address was public, asking her, first of all, arguing to her as a member of the overseas Chinese community that she should be outraged by this misrepresentation of China, and that she should join in and send out this alternative, objective view of China to her friends as well. And she was quite taken aback. First of all, as I said, she's never identified herself as an overseas Chinese, even though she certainly has lineage, it's not very much. She's never joined any overseas Chinese associations, clan associations. So for me, that was a really worrying example at a very individual level where somebody who wasn't even identifying themselves as overseas Chinese was being targeted by people, and obviously it was coordinated entities that were trying to argue that since she is overseas Chinese, that she should work with the Chinese state to correct the misunderstandings of China's Olympic torture debate. And she was quite taken aback. So that's just one example, I'm sure, of many, or somebody who wasn't even part of the conversation, as has no affinity with many aspects of the PRC government, was targeted in a quite comprehensive way, in ways that she didn't even realize she could be. So if that happens in Australia, and it's quite worth noting in Singapore, of course is unique in Southeast Asia, being majority ethnic Han population, and without a doubt that certainly increases Singapore's own concerns about the attempt not only to link party, state, Chinese people as one kind of collective harmonious group, but reaching out into the, what is called the overseas Chinese community.
So Peter, feel free to jump in on any of the issues that have been raised. I also wanted you maybe to look at a little bit what tools you think China is using that are being effective, and looking out a little bit what tools China might employ in the future in their public diplomacy efforts that we should be paying attention to.
Well, let me narrow the scope of that down to a smaller piece. With respect to the kinds of things that Malcolm was just talking about, if we're going to lump that under sort of United Front work or overseas Chinese affairs work, which is now organizationally been moved under the United Front Work Department, you see a number of different tools being used. So, first, crowding out the media environment, which takes place through sort of direct purchases, through co-opting people, through replacing content where it's too expensive to keep functioning. And, here's the Xinhua, here's the CNTV, here's the CRI, here are all of the different pieces that you can simply put in and broadcast. In some cases, sort of government-sponsored media in other countries, looking at you, John, have actually done the same thing, broadcast that content sharing. And sometimes these things are not important because of the message. We're not thinking, I think when in some of our societies that think of propaganda as being a dirty word, we think about propaganda as being a message. And if you're looking at what took place in, say, the Soviet bloc during the Cold War, the message is not really the most important piece of it. The control of the media and the state power that's behind it is the most important thing. To throw a proportion out there that may not be exactly accurate, but you might call propaganda. 10% message, 30% medium, 60% state behind it. And one of the pieces that's sort of been discussed, when you have that coercive arm, it can be used to provide a sort of an additional pressure. It's not just about emails to talk about torch relay things. This involved a foreign government sponsoring violence against our citizens on our soil, which gets into a pretty dangerous piece. So it goes, I think the spectrum runs from this kind of here are some benign themes to all the way up to that level. And it's important to think that that's a big piece of the spectrum.
Yeah, look, if I could just jump in there, I think that's actually a question that gets to the heart of many things. Looking at how exactly did Chinese language media throughout many countries in the world, including Australia and I dare say parts of Southeast Asia, US, Canada, New Zealand, elsewhere, how is it that so much of the content in those jurisdictions is now provided through to Beijing affiliated players? And this is where I think we quickly run into the need to do lots more research on organisational structures. And so in Australia, for example, you can trace pretty clearly that the relationships between proprietors of a lot of the Chinese language media stables and front organisations that are clearly linked to the United Front Work Department. And there are other kind of organisational links as well. But my point, and I think it's really important to emphasise that these things don't just happen through gravitational pull or by accident. There are organisational mechanisms that have led them to happen, and that's what we need to focus on. And what are those mechanisms? And when we look again and we understand those mechanisms, what about them do we think is legitimate, and what about them do we think is illegitimate? And clearly, if there are backdoor ways, for example, for avoiding foreign investment rules screening, then that's an obvious candidate for review. If there's deceptive conduct, if there's sort of covert funding mechanisms, then we need to kind of have a look and in some cases unpick those relationships, because I think Peter's point is exactly right. If a foreign state directly or indirectly controls most of channels of communicating, media channels communicating with large diaspora problems, then they have, to some extent, the host country loses sovereignty over large sections of their community, and that's a real challenge.
To add another mechanism that also sort of goes back to the report, there's a question of what is the point of the sister cities type of relationships. And when you look at the way China, the CCP has built political influence, and in some cases if you just think about it in terms of how China opened formal diplomatic relations with the rest of the world, the United Kingdom, with Japan, you see sort of the considered effort of how does political influence function in that country, and how as the CCP do we sort of move up that ladder. And in some cases you can see it very clearly with opening opportunities for businessmen or business people generally to come into the Chinese system and have some success, because that gives them credibility among their peers because they made money. Two, they become, in Zhou and Lai's words in discussing Japan, a kind of lobby within the system that we don't have to direct and we don't have to control, but they'll speak on our behalf because they've benefited from this relationship. Another way relating to the sister cities is simply that in a democratic society, today's council person is tomorrow's congressional person, or they become part of the provincial or state party apparatus where they have influence in deciding how things are conducted. And there are a couple of news stories coming out later this summer, I think, in the United States about how China did this in California, and I think in New York. Australia has publicly expressed concern, or perhaps it was leaked from ASIO, that they had told policymakers that there were at least 10 different candidates at lower levels that were believed to have been supported to move up the rank of the system. And you can see in a number of different areas where different parts of the Chinese system or the party system have started focusing on lower levels because these are people who can't afford a big staff. They don't have the tools to evaluate who they're interacting with. And I think this gets to a point that John was talking about earlier. Transparency is not passive. It actually takes some work. And to pick, in some ways I feel sorry for picking on him, but given his home ministry, I don't feel badly. Someone that I think a lot of us in this room have interacted with in one form or another, but Dr. Cui Liru, the former head of the China Institutes of Contemporary International Relations. You can look around and find things, and you will never, ever, on any event, see that Dr. Cui Liru is identified as a bureau director within the Ministry of State Security. But that's his position. When you see him listed now as the former director and a CPPCC member, nowhere do you really have an easy resource to find out what is the CPPCC, what does it do within the Chinese system. And since the CPPCC just completely scrubbed their English language website, you now don't even have that as a resource, and the Chinese language material isn't really a good resource for describing what it is or how it functions.
I'd like to look at a different element, looking at public diplomacy, United States and China. I think one of the greatest tools and platforms for US public diplomacy is the first speech made by any Australian or Japanese, used to be Canadian, but probably not, after the G7 meeting in Quebec, foreign policy speech, where they will argue the cornerstone of Australian or Japanese, South Korean foreign policy is our alliance relationship with the United States. That's the first point. Even Li Hsien-loong's speech at the 2015 Shangri-La Dialogue had a whole section at the beginning. So criticized Japan for not dealing well with World War II, criticized China's aggressive actions in the South China Sea without mentioning the name of the major power doing that. Good sign of effective Chinese public diplomacy not being named. But had a whole section on the importance of the United States for regional stability. If you look at two examples come to mind about the effectiveness of not direct, but host country or host actors, public diplomacy in line with a country. I think when Prime Minister Abe's first term in Japan, so if I remember that was 2006, Keidanren, the large peak association for major Japanese industries, which usually don't play in the public diplomacy space, published a letter by their chairman from one of the multi-billion-dollar Japanese corporations, hoping that under Prime Minister Abe, the relations between Japan's approach to relations with China would be more cooperative and less fractious as they were under Prime Minister Koizumi at that time. That was a very unique entry into the Japanese public diplomacy discussions about relations with the PRC. Similarly, in the Philippines, when President Aquino, after losing a shoal and having Reed Bank on the continental shelf of the Philippines, not being allowed to explore for oil there, so certainly Aquino did not come to power wanting to be the frontline state challenging China's actions at all. So that's a misrepresentation for those that think that. But if I remember, I might get the acronym wrong, the Federation of Filipino-Chinese Chambers of Commerce also came out with a similar call during the Aquino administration, asking for a more cooperative approach from Manila to relations with Beijing. That's very powerful, probably much more powerful in many ways domestically in those countries than anything the US would do or anything that China would do.
So before we turn to all of you to join in our conversation, I just want to ask Dr. Zhao one last question. Some of the discussion about China's public diplomacy in my country, in the United States, has raised the issue of reciprocity and the lack of reciprocity. And of course, our political systems are so different. And that makes reciprocity very difficult. And I'll cite one example. I still receive the hard copy at my home. A lot of people, of course, rely for their media on digital formats of media, but we still receive the Washington Post in my house.
And I think it's about once a month that we have this insert from China Daily. It is an advertisement. I don't know how much the Washington Post receives in income, actually, from China Daily and including this in the Washington Post. But this insert is included in many English language newspapers all over the world. And yet, that opportunity is not open to any other country or newspaper, really. It's not a government thing. So, you know, if the New York Times, which is blocked in China and really can't, both English and Chinese language, can't get out its message in China, but if any news media organization wanted to buy advertising in, you know, People's Daily, for example, and have an insert, you know, that option just wouldn't be available. So, you know, how do we deal with the fact that there's just such a lack of reciprocity because of the difference in the nature of our political systems?
Okay, for the medias and you know, it's applications in public diplomacy. My views is all the mass media and including the organizational communication such as sister cities and other, all will be out of date because we stepped into a virtualized or digitalized world. So more and more people, you know, living in a virtual world. So that's cross the border and bring all the stakeholders around the world together. So the logic of our work has been transformed from the politics among nations mentioned by Professor Hans Morgan from 90 decades ago to a new or an alternative paradigm for politics among network. So China Daily, People's Daily. So these newspapers are not, you know, welcomed by the young generation or even the older people. They enjoy the WeChat. They enjoy the social media, the APP. They live in a very small world. They just care about themselves. So for these people, they, on the one side, they are, you know, they are very, you know, isolated with others, network, but they are globalized, you know, focused on specific interest. So it is hard for us to identify who is the Chinese people, who is American people. So because a lot of Chinese young generation lived in US, you know, maybe early higher school, the middle school. So in Australia, you know, majority of the class are Chinese. So they have the local connections, you know, and maybe connected strong with the local citizens in Australia. Then, you know, they met up China. So in the coming decades, Chinese will be redefined. So not only the yellow skinned people can be regarded as Chinese, maybe the black, you know, the white. So all over the world, people will be the membership of Chinese people. So we should make adaptation to this new change. You know, now language is not trouble for public diplomacy because more and more companies developed artificial intelligence. So, for example, a well-known company affiliated with the China Science and Technology University, Heda Xunfei, to develop the skills of, you know, to software of, you know, interpretation. You just bring your cell phone or smartphone, you can speak Chinese, and then it translates into the local language. So it's very easy for Chinese people and the visitor, tourists, and the businessmen to communicate with the counterparts of the host countries. So all these revolution change, we should respect it. We should make adaptation. So, and the only way for the government to, you know, to promote public diplomacy in a digitalized world is to, you know, to empower the, you know, the NGOs, companies, and make the to be a resource of public diplomacy, and to focus on the capacity building of these new players in public diplomacy. And according to my investigation, so there is a big plan in these new arenas in China to develop new categories of public diplomacy. And it can even redefine the Communist Party of China. So China, according to the political report of 19th Party Congress, so Xi Jinping mentioned the Chinese Communist Party is not only a people's party, it's not only a national party, it's a party for humankind through the One Belt and Road Initiative. So that's a big ambition. So we cannot guess whether it can be success. But the real trouble of China's public diplomacy is towards the values. So for US, for United States, the values are very clear: liberty, democracy, rule of law, transparency. So all are very clear. But what is the Chinese values? So that's the trouble. So the people, the Chinese people has already all over dispersed all over the world, but without the mother country's value. So this is a big trouble. So I do believe the Communist Party and President Xi and his colleagues should respect the common values around the world and make a difference to that. And meanwhile, China should find its strong legacies, from 2,000 years, and to present a new value for our new world. So that is the core of the public diplomacy in the coming years. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to open up the floor to questions and comments. If you just line up at the microphones, and please identify yourself and make your comment or question short so that we can get as many as possible. If you wish, you can target your question to a particular member of the panel, and we'll collect 3 or 4, and we hopefully will have time for a second round. Yes, right here.
Thank you. I'm Peter Lin from ISEAS. I'll try to keep it brief, but I must say that the Japanese occupation of Singapore delayed my education by 2 years. So I was an 08 student in 1946. China, I think, Mao Zedong took over China in 1949. So soon after that, my mother, who never went to school, came home with a small cardboard card. She said, keep this all your life. You're a Chinese citizen. Don't lose it. There was the old regime, not the communist regime. So, listening to Dr. Zhao, whose intentions are very good, makes me think that, hey, well, some people think that China wants to colonize the world and make even the black Chinese. So, so that may worry some people. But my question is, how do we, assuming the best of intentions on the part of China and other superpowers, how do we close the ideological gap? Like Singapore has an interfaith dialogue where people of different religions, very different values, try to find common ground. So can we be talking about transparency and international diplomacy, get together and overcome this ideological gap? Australia, for example, I just asked a question: did you guys overreact to what the Chinese are doing? The answer was yes and no. They should have reacted early on. Now they have no choice but to overreact. But is that our condition? My question is, can we do it better?
Okay, great question. Michael?
Michael Rascal from ISEAS. I have a question. So we conceptualize Chinese conceptions of public diplomacy as being evolving, past, present, and future. And Dr. Zhao mentioned sort of the emerging concept of new public diplomacy. To what degree can we conceptualize Chinese defense diplomacy as part of the overall public diplomacy? For example, Chinese arms exports. Could that be a new form of public diplomacy in the West? Thank you.
Okay, over here.
I'm Alan Chong, Center for Multilateralism, RSIS. I was quite piqued by this talk about transparency. Is this actually the issue, or rather one of familiarity? Again, I'm picking on what Dr. Zhao was saying. If you're familiar, even if you're a dictatorship, we can still work with you. It seems like so much of China's public diplomacy is about this. Why shouldn't China go out there and create more familiarity for itself, and then the partnerships can begin, and so on. And secondly, why is none of the panel talking about the vacuum effect in world leadership? We are talking about Chinese public diplomacy as the centerpiece of our discussions. Is it because the BRICS, United States, European Union, they are just giving up on leadership for world order right now? Thank you.
Jason Katsoukas from Bloomberg. A question for Dr. Zhao. The Australian Parliament has said today to pass foreign interference laws aimed at curbing Chinese meddling in Australian affairs. How do you expect Beijing to respond? And a question for John. Perhaps do you think, John, any other nations in this region will follow Australia's lead and seek to pass their own similar kinds of laws?
Why don't we take those four first, and then we'll come back to you. So why don't we go in reverse order? John, that question was posed to you. Will other countries in Asia follow Australia's lead?
Look, I've got no idea whether other countries will emulate Australia or not, but what I can say is there are now a very large number of countries, particularly the more robust, well-established democracies, that are very engaged in this conversation about the category of foreign interference, including from China, and what to do about it. In terms of actual legislative responses, there's no question that this is a live issue in the US. I mean, Bonnie and others can talk more about this, but I've never seen, there's no country that's Xeroxing Australia's proposed legislation, but there is lots of moves to think about how to improve, for example, the Foreign Agents Registration Act in the United States, and there's similar discussions going on at different levels in Canada, in the United States, in New Zealand. So I think that there will undoubtedly be more legislative moves in more countries. What exact form it takes, who knows, but I'm pretty sure that the conversation that was live first in Australia has now spread to a bunch of countries around the world, so there's going to be much more in this direction to come.
The question on vacuuming world leadership, perhaps one way to frame that question is the success that China's seen so far in its public diplomacy efforts in large part due to the vacuum in world leadership. So who would like to comment on that?
So there is a misunderstanding or misperceptions of China's intention of public diplomacy and even diplomacy in general. Because President Xi mentioned he wanted to develop a new major country diplomacy with China's characteristics. So that's disseminated a message to the international audience. China wants to be another superpower beside the United States. So based on my interviews with officials and even some top leaders, so I find that the consensus of the top leaders has a clear position not to be number one in the world. We enjoy number two in the world, which we hope the United States should acknowledge China is number 2 in the international governance or transnational governance. Because number 1, we are provide more public goods. So we hope the United States can be the global leader, and China can be how to say the number 2, follow the United States. But now the mainstream allies in US do not acknowledge China as number 2, and maybe even to launch some tariff or trade disputes with China. So China want to not resist the competition to be the world leader, but want to promote the reform of the international global governance system. So that's my observation for the global leader. Okay.
Peter?
A quick point on called the timeline question of where you have a global leadership factor and where China's public diplomacy or united front or external propaganda efforts are ramped up. A number of the key dates were mentioned. 1999 as going out. Another date is in 2000 about a different approach for dealing with Australia and New Zealand. Significant injections into modernizing the external propaganda department. We're building China's discursive power abroad. Really are in 2005, 2006, 2007. So we're not talking about a set of activity that is really related to filling a void, but rather how China operates in the world as it is.
I think those are excellent points. I perhaps might argue the efficacy of Chinese diplomacy in recent years, maybe in part due to some vacuum in global leadership, but not driven by that. And that's very much coming from China's own foreign policy design. There was a question about Chinese defense diplomacy and whether arms export should be included in a broader definition of Chinese public diplomacy. Who would like to respond to that?
Yes, so that's the reality. President Xi Jinping attended a working meeting for the we call it a military diplomacy rather than defensive diplomacy. So just to put a military PLA have some position in the diplomatic system. So China government encourage the PLA to go abroad to attend the military exercise with the counterparts, not only in Asia but also with the United States, Russia, and the countries of Central Asia. So that is a very mature design for the military diplomacy, and it also has some public dimension of military diplomacy, such as the Chinese Academy of Military, State Defense University, has a training program, based in Beijing, to educate the officials or the military agencies from the African countries and Asia and Latin America countries, to promote the dialogue. And in Beijing also they launched the Xiangshan Dialogue or World Peace Forum. The military officer also invited to bring together such like Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore. So that's all can be regarded as the military public diplomacy.
How do we close the ideological gap? Okay.
Yeah, that's a real puzzle for us. Since 1980s, I have been educated as party members of Communist Party. I have an ideological education from the primary school to the higher education level. So and from the observation of outsiders, since 2012, maybe China has begun another directions of the ideologies. So from late of 1970s to 2012, under the directions of Mr. Deng Xiaoping, we take a pro-US or pro-Western route in terms of ideology. But now, Communist Party want to consolidate the ideology front, to win the support domestically. And but on the other side, Communist Party also want to share some values with the counterparts around the world. So Xi Jinping mentioned the new concept of global governance, to join the discussion and share with others, something like that. So maybe that is a theoretical question for the theorist or official ideologist of China. So this year, the Department of Central Publicity issued a lot of program related to that. We call it some program related to the community of shared future. So a lot of scholars and professors at universities join this program. They want to find some common values, common interests, and common responsibilities, to be the main pillar of the new ideology. I don't know. I'm not sure it can be success, but it can be identified as some evidence that the top leader want to do that.
John, do you want to comment on whether there has been an overreaction in Australia?
Yeah, happy to. Look, that's a live conversation in Australia. Has Australia overreacted? In my view, this conversation can get very foggy very quickly. What exactly about Australia has overreacted to the challenge of Chinese interference, by which I mean Chinese Communist Party interference? Well, we've got a couple of structural changes that are now on the brink of being implemented. One is they have consolidated some institutional changes so that foreign interference can be managed at a high-level task force inside the Home Affairs portfolio. That's new. There was no sort of bureaucracy that reflected this challenge before. And as the reporter Jason previously alluded to, this week Parliament is likely to introduce two bits of legislation. One which is designed to criminalise political interference from a foreign state, and the other which is designed to impose transparency for actors who are acting on behalf of a foreign principal. Is this an overreaction? Personally, I think quite to the contrary. The question is why we took so long to get there. These are obvious vulnerabilities in our democratic functioning. They're being closed up. So I think, and in a couple of years' time, I think this will be a consensus view. These were not overreactions. They were overdue. People sometimes talk to the robust nature of the conversation, the political discourse back in Australia, and I have trouble sort of apologising for having a robust conversation about really important issues. We need to debate these things. If we're going to be overhauling our counterintelligence apparatus, if we're going to be identifying a new challenge and restructuring our bureaucracy to deal with it, we need to talk about it. This is not always going to kind of be a neat kind of diplomatic conversation between neatly defined lines, but I don't think the conversation has gone overboard. In fact, I think it's been really, really important and necessary to have, while being really conscious that there are risks, and on the whole, I think that the main players have been cognizant of the risks of this conversation becoming racialized. That would be a grave mistake, but I don't think it has happened this way. And there can be a risk of overreaction if that means trying actively sort of aborting the program of engagement with China. That would be a grave overreaction, but I don't see that happening either.
And let's take a few more questions. We have time for maybe 2 or 3 more if they're quick.
Well, China's foreign influence activities from the discussion are conducted partly by traditional agencies, like in other countries, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the economic agencies, but also but these, the traditional agencies, they are not always very transparent, but then by secretive party organizations, like the United Front Work Department, International Liaison Department, perhaps even the Propaganda Department, which are all Leninist institutions and cannot be transparent and open. Now, so which side has more weight? Ultimately, I think the top coordination is done by the party. How much weight do the most secretive organizations carry overall? There must be coordinated somewhere. So partly is command, partly curiosity.
Surya from ISEAS. It's a question addressed to Professor Zhao. I would like to know whether China has any particular public diplomacy stance on the new geopolitical terminology being used by the US and India, that is Indo-Pacific instead of Asia-Pacific. And also you said that China would like to be number 2 in the world. Does it mean that it would like to be number 1 in Asia?
One last question over there, yes.
Hi, I'm Suya, and I'm from RSA Center for Multilateral Studies. And I'd like to hear your views on the intentions or goals of China's public diplomacy. I'm wondering specifically whether China is interested in socializing more actively as an active member of the community, or could we say that China is more interested in revising the existing order and changing the status quo? Thank you.
If I heard that correctly, you're interested in whether China is interested in revising the international system?
Not the system entirely, but I'm wondering whether they're interested in maintaining the status quo, or is interested in changing the existing order eventually. I think it is also related to the questions about the leadership. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think that last question perhaps goes beyond the scope of the discussion of public diplomacy, but is certainly about the goals of China's foreign policy, and public diplomacy being one part of that. So Dr. Zhao, why don't you start with that? China is, I think, often says that it wants to strengthen the international system. Usually Chinese leaders don't talk about how they want to revise the international system, but how would you characterize whether China wants to maintain the status quo or change the international order?
There is a big debate in academia and policy communities in China in terms of this topic. For some scholars, they want China to open another kitchen. That means another world is possible. So China should create an alternative in terms of international order or global governance system. So, and the majority of the experts or professors in universities reject this initiative. So China should stay in the established framework of the established international order. So that is the debate. But thus far, the top leaders acknowledge that we should polish some furnitures, in the framework or in the established framework, rather than overthrow the established order. So China wants to consolidate the foundations of the established order formulated by U.S. and the victory countries since the end of the World War II. But the U.S., Donald Trump, they all threw it away. So that's identify China is a cyclical powers rather than resistance. So that's the brief response for that question. So we reject the open another kitchen. We just stay in the kitchen and do some polish for the furnitures.
Who would like to, of our other panelists, would like to address the issue of how much weight should be accorded to the more secretive party and Leninist institutions? John, Peter? Yeah?
So John and I were jotting down our different sort of view of this in the organization of the party and departments. And the way that I've chosen to draw it out is that you have party leadership, not state leadership at the top. You have a political Politburo standing committee member, you have 2 Politburo members, or 3 actually, and only one of those has a state position, and that's Vice Premier Tsinghua. At the next level, sort of the action agencies, if you will, are the International Liaison Department, the Propaganda Department, the United Front Work Department, and the CPPCC. And those are all party organizations. And when you look at the way that the activities function, you see the ministries down below, Ministry of Education, we've talked about with Confucius Institutes, there's the Ministry of Culture, there's the Ministry of State Security, there's all sorts of other organizations that are involved. And they sort of pitch in according to their platforms and capabilities and what they have to offer. But they're not the ones driving the policy and sort of creating the initiatives. That, I think we have to say, just from that structure, it's intrinsically party related, not from the state.
The last question is about the change in U.S. strategy from a focus more in the Asia-Pacific to the Indo-Pacific, which to my mind is one that's actually more of a name than substance, because I think the United States was really paying attention to India, and India has always been in the operational area of operations for our Pacific Command in any case, but now we have formally changed the name of the command to the Indo-Pacific. So let me ask 2 people to comment on this. The question was directed to you, Dr. Zhao. Do you think that this has significance? And Malcolm, maybe from somebody who's in the region, you can tell us what the reception is here to the name change in U.S. strategy. First you, Dr. Zhao.
And that gentleman mentioned China won't be number 2 in the world, but number 1 in the Asia. Yeah, so that's not a question. So the U.S. is the number 2 in the world. That also means the U.S. is number 1 in Asia Pacific. So according to China's position, we prefer the world of East Asia rather than Asia Pacific. So China invests more and more resources into the cooperation framework, in East Asia, but also participate in Asia Pacific, led by the United States. So the difference between America's approach and China's approach is whether it can share with others. So from America's approach, we should follow the Washington Consensus and some other established rules. We do not have any choice. We just compliance with these rules. But according to China's approach, we can sit together to discuss the possible rules. China does not have the preconditions for the rules, so we can sit together to discuss the details. Every participant can make contribution to the rule setting or non-setting or standard setting. So there is a more flexible approach to this regional cooperative framework. So that's the difference. Share and does not share. So China want to develop a cluster diplomacy with the United States. And Mr. Yang Jiechi acknowledged publicly, China welcome Americans' presence in East Asia and Asia Pacific because it can benefit China over some sensitive issues. For example, the U.S. can manipulate the request or demands of the allies. So that's if Japan and some other American allies want to violate or want to change the established rules, U.S. can manipulate it. China can welcome United States as a leader in this region. So and take as a rider, maybe not a free rider. China should buy some tickets for the Americans bus. So that is the reality now, and will be the reality in the coming decade. Thank you.
I think that I would also note, however, that Xi Jinping, I think it was in 2014, at the Conference for Interaction and Confidence Building Measures in Asia, really called for Asia to be run by Asians themselves. And the United States was not included in that, and I know that Xi Jinping has not stated that again, but it has made many be more skeptical of the idea that China really does want to include the United States in this region. So just a comment. I just wanted to ask Malcolm to comment on how the Indo-Pacific is viewed in this region.
I think many ASEAN watchers would think that China's very close relationship with Cambodia affects Cambodia's actions quite effectively within ASEAN, even though China is not a member itself, more effectively than US allies may act along the lines of US interests as well. Indo-Pacific, three disparate comments. One, of course, the BRI is the most ambitious and rolling out institutional structure that covers the Indo-Pacific region itself. So if we're talking about the Indo-Pacific as a new, broader strategic space that connects Western Pacific to the shorelines of Africa, then the BRI is certainly well ahead of anybody else. So if I was the Chinese, I would say we're Indo-Pacific as well. As an Australian, the Indo-Pacific became the regional name, replacing the Asia-Pacific well before Donald Trump came into power. I think it was the 2013 Defense White Paper, if I remember, that made it. I think the 2011 Asia and Australia in the Asia Century had a discussion about it from an Australian point of view. How does Australia view its primary strategic region? And they talked about the difference between Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific. 2013, the Defense White Paper, Australia produces a lot of defense white papers at the moment, moved that way. The 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper as well. So the Indo-Pacific, each of the countries that's associated with it before have their own reasons for doing it that aren't driven by the United States, I think. Within Southeast Asia's got a regionalism problem. So they're very committed to the Asia-Pacific region, and they're very committed to the idea that ASEAN is central to the management of that. So any regional idea, even if it's just talking about a region, not creating new institutions, that doesn't start with those two components, is almost automatically seen to be a threat to this idea. And the more that Southeast Asian countries become worried about shrinking autonomous space for non-major powers, the more that commitment to the idea of the Asia-Pacific as the region, with ASEAN as the central body, is certainly when it comes to Southeast Asia, as you can see with the reaction. For example, the Quad meeting, that was a 90-minute meeting of deputy secretary level people. It had more media coverage and over-analysis I've ever seen for what was a single 90-minute meeting, 90 minutes, with no joint statement after, no plan for another meeting, no discussion about an Indo-Pacific.
They've actually already had a second meeting, but...
But it shows, yeah, so when it comes to selling the free and open Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia, it runs into that major problem.
Well, this has really been a very rich discussion, and we've reached the time now for lunch, and we're going to take half an hour break. Everybody can get their lunch and sit down, and approximately 1 o'clock, maybe 5 minutes after, we will have our keynote speaker. Please join me in thanking all the members of our panel.